This is not a comprehensive history of FC Sankt Pauli. We are not covering everything that has happened and is happening to the club. It's also not a complete history of Hamburg or Germany. It's one story, a single thread running through the fabric of football. We liked it and thought you might too. But we also want to do the club and people involved justice. So if you think we've missed or misrepresented any points, or can think of push-off points for future videos, please let us know in the comments. As touched on in the previous section, some of the Hafenstraße squatters were young, working-class men. As is often the case, they loved football. But this was far from the norm on the left. The left-wing intelligentsia viewed the game with suspicion and contempt. It was seen as a distraction from the social issues that truly mattered. And to compound this, most of the politicization of football fans in the 1980s had a sharp right-wing edge to it. Indeed, the infiltration into German football by neo-Nazi groups was a huge problem. The combination of their hateful, violent ideology and the wider spread of hooliganism sent attendances spiralling down and cast a dark shadow over German football. At this time, Hamburg's HSV were one of the best teams in Germany and Europe. Between 1976 and 1987, they won the Bundesliga 3 times, finished runners-up 5 times, and won the DFB Pokal once. In continental football, they won the European Cup Winners' Cup and the European Cup, as well as losing a further European Cup final and UEFA Cup final. But as crowds flocked to see them, so too did an unsavoury element of society. Nick Davidson explains, gangs of skinheads with Nazi sympathies began to assemble on the west terrace of the Volksparkstadion. Many young, unemployed working-class lads were coveted by neo-Nazi groups, preying on the economic uncertainties of the time. On the 16th of October 1982, this toxic presence came to a head. A HSV fan group called Die Löwen, the Lions, clashed with the Werder Bremen fan group Die Treuen, the Faithful. The HSV fans armed themselves and attacked the fans from Bremen. In the ugly scenes, 16-year-old Adrian Maleka was struck on the head with a brick. He died the next day as a result of his injuries. The neo-Nazis in the Volksparkstadion were not a majority. Indeed, plenty of HSV fans were dismayed with what was happening and complained to the club, but with little in the way of tangible results. During the 1985-86 season, and despite being in the middle of HSV's golden era, some of these disenchanted fans decided to check out the Wilhelm Koch Stadion, home to Sankt Pauli. They simply wanted a different football experience, one without hate, violence, and extremism. But what about the rivalry, I hear you ask? Again, Nick Davidson explains that this really wasn't an issue. In Hamburg at that time, the intense rivalry that exists today simply wasn't there. Unsurprising really, as for the vast majority of the two clubs' history, they had operated at different levels. Indeed, although Sankt Pauli had traditionally drawn large parts of its support from workers and residents around the port, many football fans had watched both sides. And, as Vinyas and Para explain in Sankt Pauli, Another Football is Possible, the fan experience at Sankt Pauli stood in stark contrast to that at the Volksparkstadion. Going to the Millerntor was a new and different experience. It was a close, humble and unpretentious neighbourhood team and had practically no far-right fans. Little by little, the new faithful grew in size, encouraged by word of mouth and friendship networks. Millerntor became a meeting point where you could have a good time and enjoy football with friends and some beers. What most surprised them was the friendly and relaxed atmosphere they found in the Sankt Pauli ground. This was nothing like the atmosphere or tensions and intolerance they had experienced at the Volksparkstadion. It was all a gradual and totally unplanned process. But fans coming from HSV weren't the only people looking for a taste of local football action. The young working-class football fans in the Hafenstraße wanted some entertainment too. Many had been HSV members before, but the 1980 to 83 triennium had broken their bond with the club. So, on the first day of the 1986-87 season, a group of around 60 punks and autonomists decided to attend St. Pauli's opening game, as Vinyas and Para discuss. FC St. Pauli was ideal for them, basically because the ground was less than a kilometre from the Hafenstraße. Their presence, furthermore, happened to coincide with team coach Willy Reimann's desire to promote an alternative football built from commitment, passion, a fighting spirit, and the heart. To achieve this, he could not have found better allies than the Hafenstraße fans, as they became commonly known. The presence of these young Sankt Paulianer fans, visibly anti-fascist and linked to the squatters' movement, was not at all liked by other teams' fans, who insultingly labelled them as Zecken, sponges, or parasitical ticks. The new fans made a section of the Gegengerade, a lateral stand as opposed to one behind the goal, their home. It became known as the Black Bloc. But not everyone there was actively involved in the Hafenstraße community. Some shared sentiments about the politics and ideology of this new fan scene and travelled in from further out. But what about the existing fan base, I hear you ask? Again, this is a lecture, not a seminar. Vinyas and Para describe the club's veteran fans and its fan club members as mainly dock workers and youth linked to the Kurden phenomenon, characterized by the rock and motorbike gang aesthetic, with sleeveless denim jackets covered with patches and badges, who had never notably taken political stances on the terraces. Most of them would describe themselves as apolitical, and the odd one would sympathize with the right. Nick Davidson expands on this. It is probably true to say that the impact wasn't immediately obvious. Initially, these new fans weren't big enough in number to change the atmosphere in the stadium overnight. It is also interesting to note that the fans from the Hafenstraße decided to base themselves on the back straight of the Gegengerade and not on the Nordkurve, the most popular terrace at the time. And then there were the relatively low attendances at the stadium at the time. Put simply, there weren't that many fans going to games, and certainly not organised and opinionated fans who cared enough to oppose the new arrivals. There was plenty of space for an alternative fan scene to grow, and over the course of the next few seasons, that's exactly what happened. As this development progressed, it became apparent that the burgeoning fan culture was entirely unique and unlike anything found elsewhere. When St. Pauli finished third, in the 1986-87 season, they qualified for a promotion playoff against Hamburg. This caught the attention of the Hamburg public and the wider German sports media, not least because word of the St. Pauli mythos had spread. Playing the second leg at home after a 3-1 away defeat, around 18,500 St. Pauli fans raucously cheered on their team for the duration of the game. They waved hundreds of flags, and the stadium pulsed with energy for the entire 90 minutes. Of equal importance, the game was broadcast live on TV by RTL, allowing the German public to see for themselves the vibrant, colourful, cacophonous atmosphere. Ultimately, St. Pauli lost the tie, but the never-say-die approach of the team and the raucous support in defeat won the club plenty of national admiration. At some point in the middle of this tumultuous decade, a flag appeared on the Gegengerade. Today, the symbol is synonymous with St. Pauli. As Nick Davidson points out in Pirates, Punks and Politics, exact details are hazy. Even Doc Mabuse, the man who first flew the Totenkopf on the Gegengerade, can't be sure of the exact date when he picked up the iconic skull and crossbones flag at a stall at the Dom and took it to the Millantor Stadium. But it must have been around the mid-1980s. Today, the Jolly Roger is plastered all over St. Pauli merchandise and regularly appears on the club's kits. But there is important symbolism behind the image. Historically, the legendary figure of Klaus Studebaker, the pirate of the Elbe, and a legendary figure among Hamburg's militant leftists, was executed near Hamburg in the early 15th century. And in more contemporary terms, the skull and crossbones had become a symbol of defiance and rebellion for the Hafenstraße squatters, as well as in West Berlin and across Europe since the early 1980s. The club itself, still rooted in its more conservative past, clearly wasn't keen on these new fans and their symbols. They instructed stadium security to confiscate the pirate flag at the next home game. However, when they tried to do so, the Hafenstraße supporters reminded the staff of their fearsome reputation. The security guards, mostly older folk and looking for an easy life, didn't put up much of a fight. At the next home game, several more pirate flags appeared around the stadium in solidarity. The process of transformation had truly begun. Bit by bit, Sankt Pauli was becoming an example of rebel football. This was no longer simply an apolitical district team. FC Sankt Pauli stood for something. Writing about the appearance of the skull and crossbones flag, Nick Davidson says, "This simple act had an enormous impact in terms of symbolism, politics and profit on both the fans of FC Sankt Pauli and the club itself." Within a decade of that first makeshift flag fluttering from a broom handle on the Gegengerade terrace, FC Sankt Pauli were firmly established as the Freibeuter der Liga, or the Pirates of the League. Amid all this change, Sankt Pauli gained promotion back to the German top flight for only the second time in their history in the 1987-88 season. Vinyas and Para explain how the timing was perfect. Promotion meant increased interest in the club, which coincided with the progressive transformation of the Millantor terraces. Joining Sankt Pauli's lifetime supporters, occupying the same spot week in, week out, and with little interest in politics, were a group of young people who, according to the veterans, made a lot of noise and dressed strangely. It was from then that FC Sankt Pauli became known as a club with an alternative and anti-system lifestyle. There was more serendipity at play too. Sankt Pauli's return to the top flight for the 1988-89 season coincided with RTL broadcasting Bundesliga matches for the first time, now exposing Germany to the Sankt Pauli ethos on a regular basis. Toward the end of the decade, however, two decisions made by the club underlined just how far apart they were in ideology from their new and growing fan base. In 1987, they tried to change the name of the club to FC Deutscher Ring Sankt Pauli, a desperate measure to ease yet more financial troubles. Deutscher Ring, a local building society, was Sankt Pauli's shirt sponsor at the time. This was, naturally, a controversial act, but the DFB rejected it outright. Then, in January 1989, club vice president Heinz Weisener announced plans to replace Sankt Pauli's humble stadium with a 50,000 capacity sports dome. Despite the eye-watering cost of 500 million Deutschmarks, the project would help to alleviate the club's debt of around 3.8 million marks, thanks to funding from Canadian investors. The multi-purpose venue had all the hallmarks of the North American model. It would host international events and have a swimming pool, ice rink, tennis courts, indoor shopping complex, and an enormous underground car park. But the sports dome would need to host a minimum of 200 events a year just to break even. And despite the astronomical cost and the fact that the project would irreversibly change the face of the club, the entire neighbourhood, and to some extent the city, there was no consultation with members or fans. Local opposition was immediate. Fans and residents united in the fight to stop the project. In fact, this act became pivotal in unifying the disparate factions of the fan base. The fans didn't want a bland, conformist all-seater stadium, and those in the wider district recoiled at the thought of increased rents and gentrification washing away small shops, businesses, and lifelong residents. To those that mattered most, the proposal represented little more than a guarantee of gentrification, of eroding Sankt Pauli's character, and erasing everything they stood for. Protests inside and outside the stadium ensured the Sports Dome project was short-lived. The club had scrapped the idea by April of the same year. By the close of the 1980s, this perpetually unsuccessful small club in Hamburg had become a very different beast. What followed in the 1990s and opening 2 decades of the 21st century are the most well-known chapters of this story. The malleable institution that was remoulded in the 1980s and early 1990s solidified into a fan-owned, anti-fascist football club fighting against racism, sexism and homophobia, lending strength in numbers to support the downtrodden of society. To try and cover all the tales of activism and protest from this period would only sell them short. But it would also be remiss of us not to shine a light on some of the most important moments, those that continue to draw people from around the world to a football club that, on the field, has been more flower house than powerhouse. A perfect encapsulation of the period can be found on Sankt Pauli's shirts, worn during the 2023-24 championship winning season. Produced in-house under the DIY label, which itself is the result of a stringent social code of conduct that demands fair pay and dignified working conditions for everyone involved in the club's merchandise supply chain, the kits, and other garments, have a sustainable product logo that includes the proclamation, "Not perfect, but better." It's difficult to summon a better or more accurate phrase to describe Sankt Pauli's history since its transformation into a cult club. They aren't perfect, of course. No football club is. But the size of Sankt Pauli's following indicates that plenty of people think there is something worth rallying behind in this corner of Hamburg. Let's start this recap in the 90s. Well, 1989 actually. In July of that year, Sankt Pauli's supporters published a fanzine called Millerntor Raw. Taking inspiration from the fanzine movement in the UK and the magazine When Saturday Comes, a group of fans wanted to make their voices heard about the poor treatment they faced from the police when travelling to away games. Hostility that came to a head at Bayern Munich's Olympiastadion. Millerntor Raw wasn't the first fanzine in Germany, but it was markedly different from previous attempts, which had been small-scale, far-right and hooligan in nature. Within only a few editions, Millerntor Raw was selling 3,600 copies per issue. And because it wasn't aimed exclusively at Sankt Pauli fans, it became yet another way to broaden the reach of the club's mythos. After the death of Adrian Mahlecker, the 17-year-old Werder Bremen supporter killed by Hamburg fans, HSV started their own fan project designed to educate young fans, warning them of the dangers of political extremism, violence, alcohol abuse and racism. Sankt Pauli had already seen some benefits of working with fans, so they asked Sven Brooks, a stalwart of the fan scene, to set up something similar. So, in October 1989, the fans, feeling increasingly empowered, carved out some space for themselves at the stadium, establishing the FC Sankt Pauli Fanladen in a porter cabin behind the Nordkurve. The Fanladen's initial primary purpose was to help coordinate away tickets and travel for fans. In fact, one of its most pioneering aspects was official away game travel on coaches and trains. But as the modern image of the club continued to evolve, the Fanladen's role became more diverse and vital. It rapidly became the engine powering the new Sankt Pauli fan culture. In May 1990, the council cancelled the contract with the Hafenstraße residents. The decision became legally binding in January 1991. Millerntor Raw immediately responded, launching a campaign to support those facing eviction, mobilizing support and organizing a raucous demonstration. This was another pivotal moment in the club's political evolution. Not only was the Fanladen sending a clear message that Sankt Pauli's supporters had solidarity with the Hafenstraße residents, but it was also becoming obvious that being a fan of the club entailed far more than just watching games of football. But still, just because you're a cult club, your fan base can still have some Early in the 1989-90 season, Nuremberg visited Sankt Pauli. During the game, pockets of home fans racially abused the opposition's Suleiman Sane. This reprehensible act again brought fan groups together, this time in condemnation of the racism. They even asked the DFB to ban racist abuse and banners from the stadium. Later, in October 1991, when some neo-Nazis in the stadium chanted "Foreigners out" at some spectators of Turkish origin, another fan responded with "Fascists fuck off." He was duly beaten up by a group of 8 people. Encouraged by Millantor Roar and the Fanladen, FC St. Pauli officially banned racist, fascist and discriminatory language in any flags, banners and chants. They were the first football club in Germany to do so. Vinyas and Para underline the importance of this moment. The affair is key to comprehending not just the club's change in mentality, beyond its politically aware supporters, but also the expansion of its support base. The two authors also highlight the significance of the Viva St. Pauli festival, held on the 7th of September 1991. This was a countercultural event organised by the Hafenstraße autonomist and squatter movement. Its aim was to collect funds to pay the debts accrued from paying fines and legal assistance, totaling 30,000 marks, by activists in these movements. The organisers' aim was for the festival to take place in the St. Pauli Stadium, an idea that was rejected initially by the club's directors, fearing acts of vandalism during the concert. Nevertheless, after the initiators ensured the event, the cost of which was extraordinarily high, nearly 20,000 marks, the club gave them space for the event to be held at the Millantor. Around 15,000 people travelled from all over Germany to attend the festival, which attracted some of the best-known rock and punk artists of the time. It became a milestone event for a generation, and no incidents took place. In fact, the money raised by Viva St. Pauli far exceeded the target amount, so the organisers decided to share what remained amongst other local good causes. These included the St. Pauli Evangelist Church, which had shown solidarity with the Hafenstraße and was engaged in important social projects with local children. The festival helped to grow the club's mass following, while further strengthening its roots in the neighbourhood. More fans than ever participated in social and community projects in the local area. Skipping ahead a few years to October 1998, the AGIM, Interested Members Group, forwarded a motion to the club's General Assembly to change the stadium name from Wilhelm Koch Stadion. After his initial stint as president from 1931 to 1945, Wilhelm Koch returned to the role, overseeing the club between 1947 and 1969. While his service wasn't in doubt, a book published in 1997 by journalist René Martens revealed that Koch had held NSDAP membership. Whether he was a committed Nazi or not became redundant for many. The club's stadium simply should not carry the name of a man who held party membership. Some of the older fan base opposed the idea, but the motion passed. Since then, St. Pauli's stadium has been called the Millantor Stadion, a name derived from one of the old gates granting access to the city of Hamburg. On the field, however, things remained characteristically up and down, emphasis on the down. The club yo-yoed between the top 2 divisions, sometimes coming perilously close to relegation to the 3rd tier. This instability took its toll on the club. The Nadir was hit with back-to-back seasons of misery. In 2001-2, St. Pauli recorded a miserly 4 wins in the Bundesliga. But, oddly enough, one of these was against the then world champion Bayern Munich, leading to the moniker of Weltpokal-Sieger Besieger. This translates, roughly, into English as World Club Championship winner beaters. In 2002, while the club was in financial meltdown, St. Pauli fans staged a protest against the club's decision to allow the men's magazine, Maxim, to advertise inside the stadium, arguing that the publication carried sexist depictions of women. It's not by chance that today, St. Pauli has the most female fans of any football club in Germany. But while relegation to the Zweite Bundesliga had a certain inevitability to it, Nobody saw the subsequent implosion coming. The following season, St. Pauli were relegated once again, this time to the Regional Liga. Nick Davidson writes of this time in Pirates, Punks and Politics. St. Pauli's relegation from the Bundesliga had obvious financial implications. Players signed to play in the top flight on high wages became a burden on finances in the second division. The club had already been hit by the collapse of a shirt sponsorship deal with World of Internet a couple of years earlier. On several occasions during the 1990s, the club had been helped out financially by then-chairman Papa Heinz Weisner. But by 2000, Weisner himself had run into financial difficulties and had stood down from his role as club president. FC St. Pauli no longer had someone they could rely on to bail them out of a crisis. To ease his personal financial struggles, Weisner sold 50% of St. Pauli's merchandising and marketing rights to a company called Absolut. The ramifications of this decision would haunt the club for years. The drop to the third tier also meant substantially less TV money in the club coffers. Add to this the cost of recent heavy investment in facilities, and St. Pauli were bailing water out of a leaking ship yet again. A tight deadline loomed, and it was make or break. To register for the Regional Liga season of 2003-04, St. Pauli, like every club, had to prove to the DFB that they had a financial reserve of 1.95 million euros. If they couldn't, they would be consigned to automatic demotion to the Oberliga, the fourth tier of German football. The club sold their youth training facility to the city of Hamburg for 720,000 euros. Season ticket sales were brought forward, with 11,700 snapped up by fans desperate to help. Then came the Retter, or Saviour, campaign. The club sold t-shirts with Retter printed on them for 15 euros to generate more revenue. They sold so many that the club could no longer source brown t-shirts anywhere, so they had to switch to black. Another initiative was Drink for St. Pauli. It's pretty self-explanatory, that one. And it raised another 20,000 euros or so. One day before the DFB's deadline, HSH Nordbank guaranteed the 1.95 million euros, and St. Pauli preserved their place in the Regional Liga. A music festival at the Millerntor rounded off a summer of extraordinary club-saving fan action. Before 2003 was out, the club also elected a new president, Corny Littmann, Germany's first openly gay football club president. Its future was secured, but St. Pauli lived out a somewhat humbling existence in the years that followed. They stayed in the Regional Liga, reduced to playing and losing against HSV's second team. St. Pauli only returned to the Zweite Bundesliga in the 2006-07 season. During this time, the club unveiled a plaque at the Millerntor that read, "In memory of members and fans of FC St. Pauli between the years of 1933 and 1945 who were persecuted or murdered by the Nazi dictatorship, a permanent reminder of the horrors the Nazi regime had inflicted on the St. Pauli district." In 2004, the Fanladen created the Antira, anti-racist, football tournament, a much-anticipated weekend of football, music, political talks and more. This came 2 years after the Fanladen and the club had pioneered Kiezkick, a project which gives local youth the chance to play football for free in their home neighbourhood. Girls-only sessions were subsequently introduced. October 2011 saw the USP, Ultra St. Pauli, along with 2 other organizations, awarded the Hans Frankenthal Prize, bestowed by the Auschwitz Committee Foundation in recognition of the USP's work fighting against fascism, racism, and homophobia, specifically the Alerta Network, an international alliance of fan groups committed to fighting fascism. The acrimonious early years of the 2010s finally brought to the boil differences between the fans and ownership that had long been simmering away in the background. Football more widely was taking bolder steps into a world of rampant commercialization and greed. For a club with such a clear ethos, striking a balance between upholding treasured principles and being a competitive professional football club that stays solvent was always going to be difficult. It's a struggle still playing out today. The conflict between the two parties centered around stadium redevelopment work. In particular, the club allocated almost half of the 4,800 seats in the new Haupttribüne for corporate clients. This was a marked deviation from what the old stand had represented. But the club then poured fuel on the fire when they let out one of the stand's new boxes to Susie's Show Bar, a local strip club. Remarkably, the idea was floated that women could pole dance during games. While the club bowed to fan pressure and banned such shows, they were permitted after the final whistle. This tone-deaf decision followed the Maxim protests years before, as well as the club awarding the title of official club drink to a brand called Kaltamushi, or Cold Pussy. The Retta campaign had only taken place around a decade earlier. Memories of the struggle were still fresh, but there was still huge unease and anger at how those in charge of the club wanted to generate the revenue needed to survive and compete. Breaking point came on the final game of the 2010-11 Hinrunde, the first half of the season. The club installed scrolling LED screens in the stadium to show text messages from supporters during the game. It was another anemic attempt to sanitize the experience for match-going fans, to dilute the focus on supporting the team. Only 6 days after the screens debuted, a new fan group formed called Sozialromantiker, the Social Romantics, and started a petition called Enough is Enough. At a time when supporters and cynics were asking questions about what it meant to be a Sankt Pauli fan, the social romantic movement united and mobilized a huge number of people. Those who led the movement and later joined it feared that the unique club they had shaped was becoming generic and staid. To set things straight, the social romantics made it clear that they wanted a 90-minute experience free of excessive commercialism, to retain strong community links, to refuse questionable sponsors, to never sell stadium naming rights, and plenty more besides. In protest, the fans ditched the iconic Jolly Roger for the Jolly Rouge, a symbol used by pirates when they intended to take no quarter or no prisoners for the first round of the Rückrunde, the second half of the season, at home to Freiburg on the 15th of January 2011. The whole stadium sang, "Bring back Sankt Pauli to me." The message couldn't have been any clearer. The LED screens went, the Susie's Show Bar contract was cancelled, and a more meaningful dialogue established between the club and the fan base. Yet the Jolly Rouge soon returned on the 25th of September 2012 for the game against VfR Aalen. This time, the club had proposed placing a police station in the new Gegengerade stand, another phase of the stadium redevelopment project immediately beside the new Fanrauma, the Fanladen, and other proposed fan spaces. The DFB's licensing agreement requires clubs to have a police HQ, so this addition was a necessity. But as Nick Davidson explains, the proposed placement was problematic. The supporters' uneasy relationship with the Hamburg police would make their close proximity to each other at best a folly and at worst a downright insult. The very idea of a police station located on the spiritual birthplace of the Black Bloc was abhorrent to a significant number of fans. The fans pushed for the creation of a club museum in the proposed space to celebrate all things Sankt Pauli. The club eventually agreed to build an external building for the police HQ. The FC Sankt Pauli Museum started putting on exhibits in 2012. On the plus side, the club had learnt its lesson. The new Gegengerade, birthplace of the mythos of Sankt Pauli, has 10,000 standing places, normal seats above, and no business seating. Today, tickets for the standing section cost €12, a clear statement that football should be affordable for everyone, and that football clubs should encourage as broad a cross-section of their fan base into the stadium as possible. The Jolly Rouge protests also took place at a time when the club had no control over merchandise featuring the now famous anatomical skull and crossbones design created by Steph Brown with help from Mats Meinke. Brown started screen printing his design on t-shirts, complete with the words Sankt Pauli underneath. They became extremely popular, iconic even, and the Fanladen started selling them. But when the club itself started selling the shirts at the stadium, Brown's own sales plummeted. He decided to trademark his version of the Totenkopf and eventually threatened Sankt Pauli with an injunction. Ultimately, the situation was resolved when he happily agreed to transfer his trademark to the club. As previously mentioned, Heinz Weisner then sold 50% of the marketing rights to the image to help ease his financial concerns. But this increased to 90% in 2004. In episode 0 of The Blizzard, Uli Hesse asks, why did the club more or less throw away the right to profit from a good part of its identity? Well, it's simple. The rights were sold at a time when Sankt Pauli was once again so desperate for cash it needed every cent just to stay alive. While the fans outperformed all their rivals, the club's officials just couldn't handle the finances and led the club to the brink of bankruptcy yet again. The even worse news was that Absolut's unusually long contract wouldn't expire until 2034. This meant that when the club shops sold the hundreds of items with the Totenkopf plastered on them, only a slither of the profits made their way to FC St. Pauli. It wasn't until November 2015 that, after a protracted legal case, St. Pauli finally struck a deal to buy out Absolut. It cost the club 1.3 million euros, but they now receive 100% of the revenue generated from Totenkopf merchandise. The club also nailed its colours to the mast for the local refugee population. A year before this, in 2014, local activists and retired football players had established FC Lampedusa, a team for refugees who had arrived in Hamburg via the Italian island of the same name. Many Hamburg residents had warmly welcomed a group of around 300 people arriving from Lampedusa, having previously fled from the horrors of the conflict in Libya that was happening at the time. But when state support dried up, some fell into homelessness and destitution. Police harassment soon followed. Residents of St. Pauli and fans of the club protested against this treatment, creating a bond with the displaced Libyans. This, in turn, led to the formation of the new football club which, after tireless efforts from a group of St. Pauli fans, was adopted by the club itself to become FC Lampedusa St. Pauli. They were the first refugee team to be associated with a professional football club. In the 2015-16 season, and then again in 2021-22, St. Pauli replaced the sponsor on their away shirt with the phrase Kein Fußball den Faschisten, or No Football for Fascists, as part of their continued efforts to fight the far right. We said we wouldn't and couldn't cover every story about St. Pauli during this time, so we'll stop here. But it's equally important to point out that St. Pauli isn't a footballing utopia. The club and parts of the fan base fall short, as we all do. At the lighter end of the scale, this sometimes revolves around accusations that it is St. Pauli themselves that represent the over-commercialization of football. The fact that Doc Mabuse and other Hafenstraße comrades left St. Pauli behind to chase their footballing kicks at Altona 93 and elsewhere provides some credence to this. But then there's the darker end of the scale. As recently as 2021 and 2023, several female St. Pauli fans alleged serious sexism within the fan scene. In late 2021, this related to verbal and physical abuse of women by members of Ultra St. Pauli inside the Millantor. The incident in 2023 took place at an away game, during which a drunk man sexually assaulted a member of a group of female fans. When she pushed him away, he then verbally abused her. No support or defense came from those nearby. The incidents appalled and infuriated. FC St. Pauli promotes anti-sexism as one of its fights. 3 of its 4 vice presidents are women, and the club made strides to finally support the women's team it had neglected for so long. The easy excuse to fall back on in the aftermath is that every football club attracts some idiots. Anyone who has ever set foot in a football stadium knows this to be true. But as tribalism grows increasingly one-eyed, St. Pauli doesn't shy away from self-reflection. Symbolic acts like painting slogans on walls and wearing skull and crossbones t-shirts and hoodies are the easy part. Reacting to real-world hate, be it racism, fascism, discrimination, or in these cases, sexism and sexualized violence, is the hard part. If you're a club whose very fabric and popularity are built on activism and solidarity, you should be leading the line, not hiding behind excuses. One small silver lining to this enormous grey cloud was the resulting creation of Awareness St. Pauli, a group established to deal with sexism, sexualized violence, and discrimination throughout the club's environment. This includes the FCSP awareness teams operating in the stands on match days. Anyone who feels threatened can use the code word PAULIN for quick, easy and discreet support. This brings us back to not perfect but better. Talking about change is one thing, being that change isn't always easy. FC St. Pauli transformed into the club they are today because enough people wanted them to. They may not be perfect, but that's never a claim they have made. They're just trying to find a better way of doing things, fairly and inclusively. In an interview with Seb Stafford-Bloor for The Athletic, St. Pauli president Michels Goedeke said, "Yes, we are not quite understandable for people, because on one side we are commercially successful, and on the other, we are against commercialization in football. How does this fit together? People have to understand that it's not a marketing plan to be against modern football. It's a strong attitude, and it's better for participation, the community, and the integrity of the competition. I want to have the most successful St. Pauli, because the more successful we are, the more we can present the values that we are all promoting in our daily lives." Football clubs reflect society. They are not rigid. They are always transforming, progressing. The values that underpin both are constantly evolving. Some people embrace this, others rail against it. But when a grassroots movement transforms a middling neighbourhood football club with a meagre following into a global symbol of rebellion and resistance, supported by tens of millions, it's fair to say they have tapped into something powerful.